Hello, my name is Shaun. I'm from Houston, and I'm here to try to inspire you about what a future Clojure editor might look like by looking to the past. Particularly, I want to look through the lens of the perception problem of parentheses. I know that Rich said in his previous talk that this is just a problem with programmers. I sort of agree with him, but as somebody who comes from a background of game design, I feel like if there are experiences that can get people past that problem, then it won't be a problem anymore. And people will start understanding the value proposition of Clojure and Lisps in general. So I'm going to first talk about what that perception problem is. Then I'm going to talk about the history of what people have tried to do to solve this problem. And then at the last half of the talk, I'm just going to jump into a demo and show you guys what tools that I've developed to try to fix this problem. This is a 4-dimensional tesseract. It's conceptually simple, but it's visually jarring, right? So what kind of experiences can we use to sort of learn this complicated thing and sort of get over our fear of that? These are scenes from games and movies. These different things that have gotten me over sort of my fear of the fourth dimension. You have these things that are aesthetics, you have good explanations, but then you also have these interactions that you can just jump into to learn about what these things are. So it's these types of experiences that I'm after. So this is how I see Lisp code, and I think how a lot of newcomers view it. It's this complicated thing that appears to be jarring, even though it's conceptually simple. So what can we do about this? So we know that this year is the 10th anniversary of Clojure, but this is also the 50th anniversary of the very first Lisp structure editor. There's a lot of history in here, but I want to give you sort of an animated tour of my favorite parts of it that I think have really interesting innovations around sort of solving this problem that I want to show you. I've made little animated versions of these different editors, and I made them to be interactive. They're not interactive here, but I would like to publish this soon, so you can check this link and sort of follow that. So in 1967, there was this thing called the BB Lisp editor. These 3 different views are the command, the focus, and the context. You cannot actually see the context when you're editing, obviously, because this is a thing that you're looking at through a teletype printer. You would type in a command, and it would show you one expression at a time. So this is how you were able to focus into this really long expressions in these single-line environments. So once you're at an expression, you could just type in a number to drill down into a child, and then press P to print it out. And all the commands were sort of based on this principle of just typing in the numbers to target the arguments. Here, you can just kind of explore it by clicking on the child instead of typing the numbers. That's just a visual aid. Out of Finland, this guy named Tim Noko actually tried to take this idea and to extend it onto a display. To sort of, what would this look like on a line-based editor? So rather than displaying an expression on a single line, he would display each of the child expressions on their own line. And then from there, you could actually move the arrow keys up and down to select a child instead of having to type the numbers. And an added benefit is you could actually modify the expressions on a line. So again, you're not seeing the context in this editor, but you can actually press P to pretty print to move between these different views, like the list-based view and then the pretty printed view. So in 1980, Emacs, this was, I suppose, one of the versions of Emacs from that time. It was the first one to actually highlight the matching parens next to a cursor. It's a staple feature of all Lisp editors today. But to me, it was a way to apply that concept of focus that we saw in the previous two in an environment that didn't allow you to see one expression at a time. So their approach to showing the focus is just by highlighting the parentheses, which is what we all take for granted today. Another innovation that they created that we're all familiar with as well was to apply structure editing commands to the text editor. So what you're looking at right now is the first structure-based editing commands for a text editor. This one is obscure. This is in 1984. I was going through a mailing list, and somebody was raving about how cool this was, and not many people knew about it. And there are no surviving images or ways to run this thing, so I reconstructed it based on what I was reading from these manuals. And what it was is, I love to describe it as a fisheye view of your code. So on the left is what you would see. It allows you to see the focus and the context around that focus, but the context would be compressed in such a way that things that were further away would be sort of compressed in your periphery. So you would always have these breadcrumbs of where you are in the function by just using the first token in each of the ancestor lists. At the bottom, you can type in commands and even insert text that way. So now we go to the legendary research center of Xerox PARC. And the first guys who made the BBN Lisp editor that I showed you first in 1967, they went to Palo Alto and they started building out the system called InterLisp. And InterLisp was the first one to have sort of this visual clickable structure editor. What's interesting about this is that you cannot actually edit in line, but you can click to select these expressions. And the current expression would be solid lined. The previous expression would be dotted lined. And those would represent the two arguments in any kind of operation you can do. So, for example, if I wanted to insert an expression from this function and paste it into another expression, I would click one of them, click the other, and then press after. So there were these click-based commands to manipulate your code. It's something cool at the bottom. In the edit buffer, you could actually put in an expression, and then it would immediately become clickable after you press enter so that you can insert expressions that way. And the last editor I want to talk about is the first one that I found because I found it referenced in a par edit README. So this was the one that sort of inspired the thing that everybody uses today. This structure editor sort of looks like a regular text editor, and it borrows a lot of the same ideas, but it deprecated the previous display editor. It uses this really interesting mouse language to constrain what you can do, but it made hotkey commands less necessary because it added a mouse language that allowed you to select sequences of things in a way that made it safe to copy and paste. These are details that you can read about in my research that I'll link you to. This next one is not an editor, but it's like an interesting idea that I found in a 2001 paper. I immediately scoffed at it, but it just eventually started growing on me. In Lisp, we like to put parentheses at the end of a function, but in C-like languages, people just like that vertical alignment, so you would just put it under the open parens so you can vertically align those. His proposal is to just put them on the same line so that they align with the open parens without wasting the lines. So you're probably wondering, this wouldn't work. And that's because in Clojure, if you're using different types of parens, you kind of notice that these things are actually being reversed. So it would work in a Lisp that only has one type of open parens, but it doesn't work here because it actually has to reverse the order of the parens. But it's an interesting compromise between the vertical alignment and saving lines. And this is an example that he used in his paper. that covers the history of the editors that I wanted to talk about. I want to talk about what people are doing today, is what we consider the practical approaches. John McCarthy mentioned in his History of Lisp paper from 1979 that the accidental creation of the interpreter tended to freeze the form of the language and kind of made these mistakes sort of unfixable. So he thought that the cond expression had too much nesting. And I think what he meant was these things. Yes, these pairs, these condition results tend to be, or can be logically grouped, but they don't really need to be there because you can just include it unwrapped. And this is what Clojure does. It sort of reduces the nesting of parentheses there just by not wrapping these logical groups together. Varying the types of parentheses are also a good way to reduce how overwhelming they are. Racket does this by simply using square brackets. So to me, when I think of a callable form, I think of parentheses. So if I see something in parentheses that isn't actually callable, that confuses me. And I feel like a lot of old Lisp programs are written this way. So there's some things that are not visually apparent. You kind of have to look at the context of what it is. So Racket does this. And like before, there is still like this unnecessary depth of parentheses. So Clojure kind of uses those square brackets, but it doesn't make it that nested. So I think this is what people talk about when they say Clojure is a Lisp that has been given a facelift. So, good job, Rich. And people have found different ways to decorate these parentheses today. Obviously, you can highlight the matching paren so you can see where your point of focus is. Since people stop seeing parentheses over time, some like to just dim them. And coloring. This is a popular one. LispWorks is an IDE that does this by default. Just by color coding, you can immediately match, and the structure becomes apparent. And finally, filling. It kind of makes sense to color it in. Some people do this. I saw some old emacs editors, plugins that do this. And hotkeying. I suppose Parrot is kind of the first to create this language of slurping and barfing things. Smart Parens is something that works outside of Lisp as well. All of these things have an interesting language around sort of motion of these parentheses and how to move them around. So inferring, there are some instances where we're starting to infer the parentheses. In old Lisp editors, you could type an incomplete statement and press enter, and it would close all this stuff for you. Interlisp had this super paren. It was a square bracket that you could use to close all the previous open parens. Let's see. Dr. Racket allows you to type an incorrect unmatching, and then it would just automatically say, oh, you meant to put this one in. So then it'll like put that in for you. And indentation. This has mostly been this is obvious. Everybody knows that these parens can be inferred by indentation. So the usual approach is to just throw away the syntax and try to use one that is just white space based. But in 2013, somebody tried to do this by pressing tab to sort of restructure your program based on indentation. So you indent a line, and then the parentheses would move around. But a few years after that, I tried to create a more complete solution that I'll tell you about. So that's the history and what we do today. And I want to talk about sort of what people are doing to try to research new solutions. And then after that, I'll tell you about what I'm doing. And I categorize these two main research directions as we're just going to try to change the notation, or we're going to leave the medium of the text editor and to try to create something new, completely new. You can barely read this because there are so many attempts to try to fix the language of the syntax of Lisp by just removing parentheses. It's been tried since 1964, you can see here. This has been visited so many times, right? What I will point to is the deepest look into this problem that I've read, and that is suite expressions. Read David A. Wheeler's spec on this, and you will learn everything you need to know about it. There were some disagreements on what the syntax should do. Should we cover all cases, or should we just keep the syntax simple? So if you're looking for something that's just simpler and may not cover a lot of cases in the perfect way, so look at Wisp if you're interested in that. And this is just quickly what they look like without the parentheses. You notice they just introduce some new syntax. So now we go to changing the medium. So this is something called Isomorph that is a structural editor. It's probably the most recent one. And this is, they treat syntax as font. So you can actually change the syntax. And I chose Lisp here just so you could see what that would look like. And just to show you that this is nothing new, like Microsoft tried this with their Visual Studio Suite back in 1995. And it looked really nice, but it was just canceled. So where do I want to go in terms of these research directions? I'm interested in the problem of building the perfect experience to get people over the problem of parentheses. And just through looking at this, how all these different approaches have been taken, I'm interested in staying inside of the notation, and I'm interested in staying inside the medium of the text editor. Like, what can we do if we just stay inside these things that everybody is already used to and using? So I want to, this is my constraint. I want to stay in these two things. So to me, if I can derive common principles from all these things that have been tried, maybe this can give us a good direction. I think we obviously need to simplify writing, be it through commands or whatever. People need a way to manipulate these parentheses in a way that's both powerful and natural. I think obviously if people want that vertical alignment in their code and some way to make their structure much more apparent, then let's make that a principle. Like, let's make structure apparent. And the last principle is elision for focus. People need a way to focus in on what they want to look at without being overwhelmed by things in the periphery. Clojure did this in a very conservative way by just removing certain types of parentheses and giving you a visual indication of the type of something just by the type of the paren. And going to even the more radical ideas of like fisheye parentheses. But really, we can just whittle this down to two basic principles. We want to make things easier to write, but we also want to make things easier to read. So I wrote something called Parinfer. It's hard to pronounce because it's not a word, but it stands for parentheses inference. And we're trying to, this only solves half the problem, but it's an important part of the problem where we should be able to write this stuff much more easily. The other half of the problem is something I've been thinking about for a few years. Like how do we fix reading while staying inside of our notation and our medium? Just real quick, Parinfer is based on a mathematical core that allowed me to sort of simplify things and to make sure things would work. I established what's called a line invariant, but just so you know that this is, there's a lot of impure parts at the edges, but in the middle is math. And just to like visually explain what that math means to me, It's essentially when you change the parentheses, the indentation should be moved in kind. And likewise, if you move the indentation, the parentheses will be moved in kind as well. So yeah, experience is important, so let's just jump into it and see what that looks like. This is the code that I wrote for all those visualizations, but we can just jump in. You'll notice that these are just normal expressions, small functions. I'm just going to do some fake things here. And this is the latest version of Parinfer right now. So let me just move this let block down and sort of put it at the top level. I can just hit backspace and completely separate it from that function. If I wanted to comment out this form, I'll just use the ignore form, right? So I can type, I'm sorry, can everyone see this? Yeah? Black on white? This could take some time. I hope that's okay. So commenting out this form, let's try that. So in the ignore form, things are sort of shifting the way you would expect because the parentheses, the indentation is changing. So the shape of your expression should be preserved. I'm not learning any hotkeys to do this. So maybe I want to put that let block back into that function. Oh, see, I got that wrong, so I can just keep going, and now I'm inside of that form. Let's see what else I can do. Let's say I wanted to use, like, I don't know, let fn. That can be a problem. Some problems happen sometimes, so you just correct the indentation. Indentation is something that is very apparent to us, so if it looks wrong, you can just fix it. Are there any questions? Like, this is Atom. Is there anybody here who uses Atom? Yeah. Any Emacs users? Most of you. Vim? Okay. Cursive? Sorry? Nightcode, yeah. Yeah. So Parinfer exists for all these editors right now. Sublime and Sublime. Sublime users? No. Tab, space. It works for any operation because all it does is it enforces this line invariant. So no matter what you do, the result will be the same. I was just deleting. There's no hotkeys that I'm pressing. I'm sorry.
If I recall, isn't there a modal aspect of Parinfer? Or maybe there was?
So one part of this is that the file has to be properly formatted in order for this invariant to work. So when you open up something that's incorrectly formatted, you don't want the structure to be changed. So it's asking you, is it okay for me to like adjust the indentation? Like if you're working on a team, that may not be okay. So it will ask you first, and if you say no, then it'll just turn off Parinfer and allow you to use it normally. And this is a feature of Atom Parinfer. Did that answer your question?
So do you have to toggle the mode? I remember Cursive had a hotkey for toggle the mode. I'm not sure if that's right.
So Parinfer exists as a mode for editors that you can enable with a hotkey, but that's it. Cursive, yeah, has that as a mode. So yeah, so there's like an indent mode and a paren mode, and I'm trying to like sort of get rid of that language and just use something. So what you're seeing here is something called smart mode. So I didn't tell you about it because it's like the user shouldn't have to care about like these details. So like the smart mode is yes, it's something that exists, and you can know the name of it, but it should just work, right? Yeah.
Was there anything, so it seems like when you have the structure of the code changing as you're writing code, you might perform emphasis on the actual way the code looks as a result of maybe how you think about the code.
Yeah.
Does that change the way you look? When you look back at the code, some way you add that or something, and it's like a graphically structure and other parts of that code, does that change the way you look at maybe the relationship between the structure that's having for dictating the code and how it works immediately?
Yeah, that's hard to summarize. Let's see. No, it's a good question. So you're saying, I'm sorry, could you like repeat? Yeah.
So it seems like when you did something in your editor, the resulting code in that block changes.
Yeah.
And that's, for me, a bit more pronounced in terms of what my editor does. Now, from like a perspective of looking at my code, it has a shape that will be affected by adding a parentheses that automatically gets applied.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that changes the way that you look at code now when you look at maybe unstructured stuff, right? Stuff that wasn't structured in this way.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay. So he was asking that because Parinfer will shift around your expressions in a certain way as you're typing, for example, the lines below it would be shifting around. I believe the question was, does that change the way you see your code and the way you treat formatting? To me, like this is how I've always kind of seen the code, to sort of have this relationship between indentation and structure. So because, I guess because it follows my own expectations for what code should look like, and maybe I'll use this question to sort of address a broader problem. There are many different types of sort of formatting styles in Lisp. Some may, for example, like, let me just show you here. So I'm going to the next line, I'm just gonna type something, and notice that paren is just like being moved automatically. So indentation implies nesting. Say again? I can try to get creative and do this. Yeah, we can do this. Is that better? So the reason why I dim them is because you don't, I mean, well, it is a visual signal that this stuff is being inferred for you. So that was the purpose of that design. But some people may not like that. That's actually a feature that I could have just changed actually in the preferences. I just didn't think to do that.
I like that they look absolutely invisible on this screen.
Oh, they look actually invisible? Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, so back to the original thing. Yes, there are different formatting styles, but let's see. So there's two-space indentation, but some people will want to indent it to the first arg on the first line, right? Like notice it's still respecting that. It's not some kind of aggressive thing that will change the indentation on you depending on like the indentation length. It's only bound to these indentation thresholds. And this is something I'm going to cover in the next slide once we're done with this demo. But in terms of like how this affects the way I see structure in my program, like I don't know. It's hard to answer because I guess I've been using this for so long that this is just how I see my code anyway. Any other questions before I go back to the slide? How am I doing on time? Oh, hi.
So, do you see any value in actually having this standard indentation? Are you saying people have different styles, so why not?
I don't know. It's preference. For example, I don't use prettier, the JavaScript linter on some of my projects because it's a human thing to want to lay out your code in a way, and I don't want this to be in conflict with it. I think linters are great for teams, but that's not what I want Parinfer to be. I don't want it to be restricting. I still want this to be a low friction environment, as much as is possible to allow this inference.
What is the best platform for stuff to use Parens?
I'm sorry, say again?
What's the best platform to use Parens?
I would say that the best one is the first one that was made by Chris. It's Atom Parinfer. And in addition to that, like the new smart mode only exists for Atom right now, just because it's still being used in development. So Atom is like sort of the premier environment right now, and then once we've proven out these ideas, then we port it to different editors. And another thing, like there are tab stops that are actually structural in nature. So I can hit tab to go to that next one, because I can infer that structure, and you can move back there, etc. So Parinfer provides the information for editors to do this. Since indentation is a big part of Parinfer, I wanted the tab stops to help you there. Okay, if there are no more questions, I'll go to the slides. So we saw how it worked. But what I want to do is to sort of visually explain what's actually going on. So what is incorrect indentation? Like, what does that mean? Well, if you try to draw a box around any kind of expression, no matter how like deep into a function it's in, and you cannot find a way to make that left edge straight, you always have to like sort of cut a corner around it, then that's incorrect. What Parinfer seems to be incorrect, and it seems to be compatible with everybody's sort of formatting conventions. There are some small exceptions. So there are two ways to fix these crooked rectangles, right? You can just straighten it out, or you can detach the offending part, which is the bottom. So this is sort of the two different modes that you were talking about earlier. And I want to call out somebody who really helped me on this problem. His name is Ryan De La Torre. He sort of, maybe this part isn't so important for you to know in order to use it, but this new smart mode sort of takes those different principles, allowing you to detach from things that were on the top and to keep things below straight. So this was like a really important realization that solved a problem that nobody could solve for a couple years, including myself. And on the left is just a general principle. If this thing is really annoying, if the straightening is kind of getting in your way because maybe you pasted an expression in the wrong place and the indentation is all wrong, and you try to like correct the indentation, it's like moving everything below like in a way that's annoying you. That the way to back out of that is to just select the expression, and then everything is sort of isolated from that line, and you can correct the indentation that way. So again, there are like trade-offs in the system, but I'm trying to balance them out in a way that doesn't introduce hotkeys, etc. So that's Parinfer. The other half of the problem that I'm actively looking at is something I want to call Locus. Stands for Lisp Focus, which represents the principle of trying to help you read this thing while staying inside of text, the syntax and the text medium. I was advised not to show it because it's a little bit too early, but what I do want to tell you is that it is based on these two principles that you can sort of visualize here. Indentation guides is something that all editors will show you. So it's something that we can sort of use in Parinfer to help you give you that vertical alignment without introducing anything crazy. And code folding is something that all editors do as well. So maybe we can use that to sort of hide the parentheses in a way if you don't really need to see them in that moment. And these parentheses are just the ones that are being inferred, the ones that were dimmed that you didn't even see. And perhaps you really didn't need to see them. But the idea is like we should not remove them, so if you're copying and pasting this text to somebody, or you're working in a team, they should still be there. But the view can kind of fold them away like we fold other things that we don't want to see at the moment. So that concludes the second sabbatical that I've taken to sort of research this idea. If you'd like to support the future development of Parinfer and Locus, I've opened a Patreon account here. Thank you very much for your time.